Hello, class. We will look at today John 11:55 through chapter 12, verse 50, and the topic will be the presentation of Jesus as the Messiah King. So let's proceed with the lecture. Verse 55. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up to Jerusalem out of the country before the Passover to purify themselves. So they were seeking for Jesus, and were saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was to report it, so that they might seize him. John notes that it was almost time for the Passover feast, and we find that the attention of the multitudes was directed toward Jesus. Because of the plot against him, Jesus had withdrawn to an area outside of the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. The conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders was open and well known. The religious leaders now felt that if their plan to kill Jesus was to succeed, they would have to arrest, try, and execute him during his compulsory visit to the feast. Otherwise, Jesus might withdraw himself from their jurisdiction again. Chapter 12, verse 1. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the city where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived. That evening, a supper was prepared in Jesus' honor in the house of Simon the leper. John records that Lazarus was reclining at the table with Jesus, and Martha was one of the ones serving when Mary came to anoint Jesus. Mary took very expensive perfume. Such gifts were given to kings, and anointed the head and feet of Jesus. Perhaps Mary understood better than the others how great was the danger of the Sanhedrin. Verse 4. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was intending to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people?" Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Judas, perhaps as spokesman for the disciples, objected and wanted to know why was this perfume, which was spikenard, not sold for 300 denarii, which is 1 denarii equals a day's wages, so that was 300 days' wages, and given to the poor. But John unmasked such pious posturing. Judas's true intentions were rather to keep the money for himself. He betrayed the trust given him as the keeper of the money box. This foreshadows his ultimate portrayal of Jesus. Verse 7. Therefore Jesus said, "Let her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." Of the gospel writers, John stresses most explicitly that Jesus' death did not come as an accident, but was fully willed and anticipated by our Lord. The evangelist's insistence that Jesus was not a tragic victim, but in full control of the events surrounding his passion, is a crucial part of the gospel message. For it places the emphasis squarely on God's sovereignty and on the unfailing plan of the ages, culminating in Jesus' sacrifice of the cross. Verse 9. The large crowd of the Jews then learned that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. Learning that Jesus was in Bethany, a large crowd came not only to see Jesus, but also Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. John records in his gospel that because many Jews were believing in Jesus due to the miracle of raising Lazarus from the dead, the chief priests were planning to put both Lazarus and Jesus to death. Verse 12. On the next day, the large crowd who had come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took the branches of the palm trees and went out to meet him and began to shout, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. Jesus, finding a young donkey, sat on it, as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's coat. On the next day, when the crowd heard Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, they went out to meet him. Such statements as Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, indicate the crowd knew Jesus was presenting himself as Messiah. In fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9, Jesus rode into Jerusalem seated on a donkey's coat. He rode not upon a war horse, but on an animal which was a symbol of peace. Verse 16. These things his disciples did not understand at the first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things were written of him and that they had done these things to him. So the people who were with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify about him. For this reason also the people went and met him, because they heard that he had performed this sign, this miracle. So the Pharisees said to one another, You see that you are not doing any good. Look, the world has gone after him. Not until later did Jesus' disciples realize that the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem was fulfilling Old Testament messianic prophecy. Moreover, those present when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead continued to testify about Jesus. Therefore, many who attend that feast of Passover went to meet Jesus because they heard he had performed this sign. All this stirred the Pharisees into indignation. Verse 20. Now there were some Greeks among those who were going up to worship at the feast. These then came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and began to ask him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip came and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip came and told Jesus, and Jesus answered them, saying, The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Two of Jesus' disciples, Philip and Andrew, were approached by some Greeks, not Hellenistic Jews, but Gentiles, attending the Passover feast. They asked Philip, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. So Philip came and told Andrew, and then both went to tell Jesus of the request. These Greeks evidently came to give the Messiah King the glory that was due him. The reader should remember that Jesus had been rejected by the leaders of Israel. However, Jesus was not to receive kingly glory from people, but the glory of the cross from the Father. Verse 24. Jesus speaks, he says, Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. He who loves his life loses it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it to life eternal. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. After indicating the time had come for his glorification, Jesus shares an analogy. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. Jesus was saying, in like manner, until he died, he could not reproduce his life in others. Those who receive life by faith in Jesus would demonstrate that life by becoming a servant of Jesus, and that one would be honored by the Father. Verse 27. Now my soul has become troubled, says Jesus. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came out of heaven. I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. So the crowd of people who stood by and heard it were saying that it had thundered. Others were saying, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus approached his imminent death completely dependent on his Father. Jesus did not petition the Father to be saved from death by crucifixion, for this was the purpose for his coming into the world to begin with. Rather, Jesus prayed, Father, glorify your name. The Father responded to Jesus' emotional plea by declaring, I will glorify it and will glorify it again. God had glorified through the life of obedience that Jesus had lived, and he would be glorified through the resurrection of Jesus. The crowd heard the sound of God's voice, but did not understand the message. Verse 30. Jesus answered and said, This voice has not come for my sake, but for your sakes. Now judgment is upon the world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out, and I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. But he was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which he was to die. Jesus indicated the voice the crowd heard was for their sake. Jesus explained that his death by crucifixion would provide life for those who believed in him, but would be judgment on the world and a judgment on Satan, the ruler of this world. Moreover, it would prove a way to himself. Verse 34. The crowd then answered him, We have heard out of the law that the Christ is to remain forever, and how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? So Jesus said to them, For a little while longer the light is among you. Walk while you have the light, so that darkness will not overtake you. He who walks in the darkness does not know where he goes. While you have the light, believe in the light, so that you may become sons of light. The crowd was not trying to reconcile Jesus' words about his approaching death with the Old Testament predictions that Messiah would reign forever in his kingdom. Jesus could have explained that it would be necessary for him to come again to establish his kingdom on earth, since the nation of Israel had rejected him as their Messiah. Instead, he encouraged them to receive the light he had come to give them. Believe in the light, so that you may become sons of light. Verse 36. These things Jesus spoke, and he went away and hid himself from them. But though he had performed so many signs before them, yet they were not believing in him. This was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, which he spoke, Lord, who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For this reason they could not believe. For Isaiah said again, He has blinded their eyes, and he hardened their heart, so that they would not see with their eyes, and perceive with their heart, and be converted, and I heal them. Jesus withdraws from the crowd because of their continuous unbelief. All this was in fulfillment of Isaiah 53:1. Their blindness and unbelief were a part of God's sovereign program, predetermined before Jesus came, so that by Israel's rejection, salvation might come to all the world. John also quoted Isaiah 6:10 to show that the blindness was judicially imposed by God. The source for this lecture came from the book The Words and Works of Jesus Christ by the author J. Dwight Pentecost.